This is the structure of the Canadian Institutes of Health Research. And there are 13 institutes, and we are one of 13. And we are unique in the world. There is no other Institute of Gender and Health in the world. And I think that's kind of cool. And I think it's very interesting that we actually are part of the puzzle. And I think it really does bode well in terms of our science that, and it was really forward-thinking individuals who placed gender and health on the map here. And increasingly, we have partnered with every one of these areas because there are sex and gender implications, certainly in terms of musculoskeletal health, certainly in terms of genetics, infection immunity, et cetera, et cetera. So we are in a unique position in that we have unique issues that we need to resolve, but we also partner with many of the other institutes in terms of our work. And it's interesting in terms of developing a strategic plan because we're also always interested in developing a niche for sex and gender work. What's our niche? So even in this area of mental health, sex and gender, obviously this sits between two institutes, the Institute of Neurosciences, Mental Health and Addiction, but also very centrally to the Institute of Gender and Health. And we see this as part of our work, is to do this partnering work and to encourage every one of those institutes to take up questions of sex and gender. So that's our structure, and so I mentioned we're unique in the world, and it's interesting, in many ways the Institute of Gender and Health grew out of the activism of the women's movement. It really was some of that very strong work talking about women's health. You think about the Boston Women's Health Collective and a lot of strong activism that grew in relation to the women's health movement. They really pushed this agenda, and Greaves et al. Developed, when the institutes were being formulated, there was a call for proposals, and some of you might have been involved in those proposals, putting forward ideas. Okay, let's have an institute for nursing, let's have an institute for physiotherapy, let's have an institute for addictions. There were over 50 submissions to the Canadian Institutes of Health Research. And Greaves et al. Put in a submission called Sex, Gender, and Women's Health. And they actually were arguing for a Women's Health Institute. Interestingly enough, and I think this was very good foresight on the part of the founders of CIHR, the Institute of Gender and Health was formulated. But it's a bit of an uphill battle because almost everywhere I go, people tend to think of the Institute of Gender and Health as just a women's health institute. There's this idea that gender issues really are women's issues, and that is not the case. We're very interested in both men's and women's health and exploring these differential effects. So in terms of the Institute, our mission basically is to foster research excellence in the development and application of new knowledge regarding the influence of gender and sex on the health of women and men throughout life, boys and girls as well. And just because it was interesting, I had a discussion yesterday with our Deputy Director who organizes our peer review for the Institute of Gender and Health, and we're talking about just because we're interested in gender and sex doesn't mean we're not interested in women-only studies and men-only studies as well. Because women, there's also gender variation and particular issues that need to be resolved in the field of women's health and men's health. So I think that's an important point to bear in mind as well. So I think we've really created a lot of momentum in the last 7 years, and we're building on a lot of strengths. And there's some strengths in particular I want to highlight for you today. First is our research chairs in gender, sex, and health, and Sonia is one of our chairs. There are 6 chairs, and we've met, and we're trying to encourage them to kind of cross-pollinate their work as much as possible. And I'm very encouraged with the quality of all of their work and how they will all kind of be beacons in their particular areas to move the field forward. So that's a tremendous platform for us. Another is recently we've launched teams in gender, sex, and health, and these teams are focusing on a variety of issues and areas, everything from particular addiction, tobacco use, to health services issues, to neonatal developmental issues. So a variety of topics being explored in relation to gender, sex, and health. And then finally, we right now have had letters of intent approved, and we're going to be doing peer review for these centers for gender, mental health, and addictions. And these centers represent another investment in terms of thinking about gender, mental health, and addiction, and hopefully will help to continue to be able to drive the field forward. So I'm very encouraged about all of this, because I think all of this movement will help us continue to create, for the momentum to grow. So we have, in my first year as scientific director, the main focus was on developing a strategic plan for the Institute of Gender and Health. And the way that we engaged in the strategic planning process is that we held regional consultations. We were here in Quebec, I think last fall. So we had consultations throughout the country. We did some key informant interviews, and we reviewed some key documents, the Institute of Medicine's report on sex differences in health and other documents as well. And then we did a strategic planning workshop with our Institute Advisory Board. Just a little paid public announcement for the Institute Advisory Board. I want to encourage all of you to think about applying to Institute Advisory Boards. The calls are still open until March 31st. You've got a few days left. But it's another way to engage and serve your research community. And so all of the institutes are always looking for renewal of our board members, and scientists play a very important role on our boards. So we met with our Institute Advisory Board last fall and developed our new strategic plan. And I want to just kind of close by talking a little bit about the plan, and I want to make sure I save some time for questions, or some comments from all of you. So you've all received a copy of the plan, and I encourage you to read it, share it with other people. Hopefully don't throw it out. You know, share it around. If you don't want to keep a copy of it, give it to a friend. And our strategic directions really are in 6 particular areas, and I want to talk about each one of them. So I'm going to move through them very quickly, because you also have the report in front of you. The first is advancing methods and measures. So I've already argued that we are not going to be able to move the field forward until our measures improve. We need to continue to work on biomarker issues. We need to continue to work on psychological measurements, scales, etc. A small example, again, I read in the abstracts that someone in their analysis in terms of sex roles was using the BEM sex role inventory. I use that as well, because there are no other measures out there. But we need to relook at those types of measures. We need to rethink them. The BEM sex role inventory was developed, I don't know, 15, 20 years ago. And because gender is culturally specific and temporal, we can't assume that our measures are going to continue to be useful. So we need to be rethinking some of these things. We don't have good measures of gender identity. We don't have good ways of capturing institutionalized gender, etc. And the same with sex. I don't think that we've really developed a sophisticated way to begin to account for sex in terms of particular health outcomes. So we're launching, this is a heads up for all of you, we're launching seed grants, Catalyst grants this June, asking people to do some work in the field of methods and measures in the area of gender, sex, and health. And that those seed grants are going to be coming up this June, and I encourage every one of you to apply. Or to think, because this would be something that you could actually embed in your own work. You might have a larger study, and you might be able to embed some measurement aspect into it. So I encourage you to think about that. Another thing that we're doing, and that first issue of methods and measures really is specifically about developing capacity to do our work, and so is this. This is about building partnerships. It's our particular goal to think about how we, because we're part of the puzzle piece at CIHR, how we can continue to build partnerships with every one of the institutes. And in particular, our Institute Advisory Board have identified aging, mental health, health promotion, and health services as areas that we really want to continue to partner very strongly in. So those are things that, and those are areas that we're continuing to be thinking about. So I want to talk a little bit about some of the other areas that we have are focusing on. The first is violence and health impacts and implications. Violence is both sexed and gendered. I'm not specifically only talking about intimate partner violence. I'm talking about aggression. I'm talking about schoolyard bullying. I'm talking about all of these aspects that have both biological basis as well as social bases. And this is a very important health issue that does need to be looked at in our society. We need to do some good thinking about this and then really start to address interventions that might actually help us to deal with violence and aggression in our society. So this is an area we're just beginning to develop. We're going to hopefully do some workshops in this area, think about how the field can develop, etc. And so over the next year, we have nothing planned for this next year, but after that you can anticipate some work in this area. And this is very much related to the field of mental health. It's an important, there's a lot of overlap, I think, that we need to be thinking about in relation to violence and mental health. Another area is sexual and reproductive health, and this is, we've identified this as a gap area. There's no other institute particularly looking at sexual and reproductive health, particularly in relationship to its outcomes for men and women and teens. There's the Institute of Human Development, Child and Youth Health focuses really on fetal outcomes, but we're really interested also in the social dynamics around sexuality and reproductive health. And so this is an area that we've targeted, and we're going to be doing a workshop this spring around maternal health, but there'll be other areas that we develop over time. Work and health is another area. Mental health in the workplace has been a big area of focus at CIHR, and this is an area that we're going to continue to work in. But we're also interested in exposures and the variety of issues related to both paid and unpaid work, and how paid and unpaid work actually influences health outcomes. You know, there's some really interesting work being done in terms of, for example, very male-oriented environments, for example, in the north in the oil patch, and what's happening in terms of particular behaviors there. And I think that we need to do more work and understand those dynamics and how they put men and women at risk. So another area, and this is an area I think all of you, I'd encourage you to be thinking about, and this will be an area we'll be developing this year, is clinical interventions enhancing effectiveness. We really do believe that every clinical intervention we need to be thinking about in terms of its impacts and outcomes and how they might differentiate for men and women. We know that drugs, devices, diagnostics, and clinical programs need to be gender and sex sensitive, and there has not been enough work in this area. So this is another area that we're going to be continuing to develop over the next while. We're very excited about it, and we think that there's a lot of different areas for this initiative to grow into. So basically, the strategic plan that we've identified, really, hopefully, you'll see strong alignment with the mental health agenda. I think there's very strong alignment there, and building on some of the platforms and investments that we've already developed at the Institute of Gender and Health. I think that we, you know, in some ways in this room, because you're here today, you've already been convinced that sex and gender matter. But there's a lot of work to be done in this field in terms of getting the word out and engaging with our colleagues in terms of relating to issues of sex and gender health outcomes. And so I encourage all of you to take that up and to be thinking about that in relation to all of your work. I guess the good thing is that we're going to be riding a wave in the next 10 years. I think we're on the cusp of something. I think that there's a lot of work to be done in this area and a lot of investment to be made. And the science of sex and gender and health is really exploding at this present time, and I think will continue to develop. So that's it's an exciting time for us to be thinking about. So I'm going to stop there, and I wanted to intentionally leave some time for questions or comments. And I'd love to hear from you in terms of your reactions to what I've had to say, questions that you might have, or other areas you think the Institute of Gender and Health need to be thinking about. So I'll leave it open and engage you a little bit.